Hello and a warm welcome to the AI with Arun show. In this episode, our guest is Steve Wilson, who is the Chief AI and Product Officer at Exabeam, which is a leading cybersecurity company that specializes in AI-driven security operations. Steve is a very well-recognized person in the field of AI, cybersecurity, and cloud computing. He has built mission-critical enterprise software and high-leverage platform for major tech companies like Citrix and Oracle and many others. Steve, I'm so happy to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Arun. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. Steve, so let's get started. So Steve, you have been in the industry for such a long time. How do you characterize the current adoption and effectiveness of AI, particularly in cybersecurity, compared to what you saw a few years ago? What are some of the notable shifts that you have been seeing?
So it's interesting. If you think back on it and you go back to the 20 teens, you rewind 10 years ago, we were in the middle of one of our AI winters. And, for decades, we've had great hopes that AI was going to solve major problems, and then we would be disappointed. And I think it was really about 10 years ago that actually real machine learning started to have an impact in cybersecurity. And companies like Exabeam pioneered things that we called user and entity behavior analytics, where we did machine learning across large real-time data sets to baseline the situation, understand normal, more importantly, understand abnormal circumstances that might indicate a problem, and use that to help companies sift through all of their cybersecurity data and find things that were important. And so for years, that was the state of the art. And, that made slow progress into the industry with more and more people starting to use it. But really, it's been in the last 12 months that we've seen another dramatic acceleration. And I think everybody knew this would happen after the large language model revolution with ChatGPT and things like that. And people very quickly started to put together demos of what this would mean. But it's really only in the last year or so that it's become real, where we're starting to see these actual really meaningful, call it agentic use cases, where we're able to apply a second level of AI and really make a proactive difference in people's security stances and their productivity inside of a security operations center.
No, that's wonderful, Steve. So you're right. We have really seen AI agents in particular. This is the year of the AI agents, right? After the LLM revolution happened. So Steve, talk to our viewers about some of the specific AI agents that you see, how an Exabeam, how is it using in the UEBA, phenomenon that you described.
Yeah. So one of the things that we realized, we introduced some early features that we called Exabeam Copilot the beginning of 2024, so 18 months ago now. But I would say they were opportunistic, and they're use cases that have become mature now, replacing proprietary query languages with natural language search. So people don't have to write a complex SQL query to search through their cybersecurity data. They can simply say, show me the top 10 IP addresses with outbound traffic to a certain country, and get back the answers that they want to really simply. But what I think we've seen now is, as we move to this future that is agentic, and that's a buzzword that gets bandied around a lot these days, but I think it means three things to me. One is these things are more proactive, more action-oriented. They can do more advising rather than just reacting. And the other one is that there are generally specialized versions of these agents that could work together or work with different people inside the organization. And so one of the approaches that we've taken is really creating a family of agents, all based off of kind of a common framework within our platform. And we call that Exabeam Nova. And the first agent that we introduced was what we call the investigation agent. And so much of cybersecurity, especially inside a cybersecurity operations center, is looking at these signals and trying to interpret which ones are important. And, people every day are making snap decisions about, do I turn off the CEO's laptop at the investor conference because I saw something in a log file? Or, or do I turn off somebody's credentials? These things on one end, you can impede the productivity of the company. On the other hand, you have to keep it safe. And making these decisions is so hard and requires so much data. So the first thing that we introduced is what we called this threat investigation agent that actually sits on top of the behavioral analytics kind of machine learning technology that we built out for a decade, but then helps interpret those signals for you and actually just presents an investigation to the investigator now. And the feedback on that is it's dramatically faster, 3 times, 5 times faster to run an investigation, which is so important. But the next one that we introduced, which a lot of people are really excited about, is the idea that we can start to advise the management inside the security operations center and really look at what products do you have in your environment and what log files do you have and how are you importing them and how are you looking at them and how can you get better? Where do you have weak spots in your defense strategy? And so really the idea that these agents go from being very tactical, we see their future being more and more strategic and really helping to advise not just individual contributors in the SOC, but even at the management level about how do I think about strategy? How do I do what if analysis on what I might do next? And how do I build my roadmaps?
Wow, so that's a great maturity model that you laid out, Steve, from being more tactical and operation oriented to building AI agents that are true, friends of the SOC managers, so that they advise them, help them strategize, and think more from a future roadmap. That's brilliant. Steve, what kind of challenges and opportunities as well that you see as your customers are adopting these AI agents?
So I think that a lot of what we've seen is early excitement followed by disappointment on a lot of these initiatives. I always tell people it's never been easier to build an amazing software demo than it is today. Ever since ChatGPT came out, the idea that you can create a chatbot that looks like it's doing amazing analysis, providing incredible insights, but isn't really doing any of those things. It's so easy. And this has led to this incredible disconnect. We did a survey with a third-party analyst firm earlier this year, and we asked cybersecurity professionals about how they thought AI was helping them. And it was dramatic. It was like 70-something% of the managers thought that the AI investments that they were making were paying off dramatically, but only 20% of the actual users thought that it was really improving their productivity. And so I think what we've seen is a lot of these things rush to market. There be a lot of that opportunity out there, but it's followed with this level of disappointment. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at what is the disconnect there. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by my conclusions, but it's all about data. We've always said good AI requires good data, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. And in this case, it's not just garbage, it's too much data. It's disorganized data. These large language models appear magic, but they are not. And especially when we're talking about cybersecurity data, people are generating not just gigabytes of this, but terabytes, petabytes. And as capable of as these large language models are getting, ChatGPT, when it came out, had a context window of a few thousand tokens. Now Gemini has a couple million, right? So it's 1,000 times larger, but it's still too small to deal with even gigabytes. So you can't just take all your data and throw it at a large language model and say, sort it out, even with advanced reasoning and all this other stuff. So you have to very carefully groom your data, reduce it down, take out the noise, find the signal, and you need to do that with some fairly traditional algorithms or at least high-speed machine learning. But if you do that and you present well-organized data, what LLMs are really good at is language translation. And so if you can provide structured but maybe hard for a human to understand data and ask the agents to make it intelligible to a human, they're incredibly capable at that.
Very, very interesting. And you are right. I mean, the context windows, while they're improving, but the kind of the content that we're talking about, or context that we're talking about in a cybersecurity investigation or a threat analysis, that's phenomenally higher than what current technology allows.
Yep.
Yeah. So, Steve, if you I'm sure there are multiple real life examples that your clients have adopted to. Of course, there could be challenges, but if you could walk our viewers through a real life example of how one of your customers actually used your solution and the kind of benefits that they're seeing.
So, I'm going to walk you through an example. I don't have the customer's permission to use their name, but I do use this case study that we co-developed with them, and we have permission to talk about it. But well, I can't tell you the organization's name. I can tell you who attacked them, which was an international hacker ring called Lapsus. If you go look it up, the last S is a $. So they're an internationally well-known ransomware group. And notoriously, they have broken into the highest profile companies: Apple, Tesla, Uber, NVIDIA. So they're pretty serious. But what's interesting is their means of attacking are in some ways the lowest tech. They often bribe people and buy their credentials. And that turns out to be one of the hardest things to detect in cybersecurity, which is as simple as it sounds. If someone has your passwords and your keys and your multi-factor tokens, they can log into the network and impersonate someone. Our cybersecurity tools traditionally have zero defense against this, right? Because they're designed as a castle with a drawbridge, and there's a guard at the front that says, "Halt, who goes there?" And if you have the password, you're in, and that's it. But as we move to these kind of more zero trust networks where you need to be checking these things all the time, behavioral analytics becomes much more important. And what was really interesting about this case was the Exabeam customer was using our machine learning detection engine, and somebody at this Lapsus group had purchased the credentials from an employee, paid them enough money to make it worth their while, and as soon as they entered the network, the algorithms looked at this and said, "This is not right. This is the right password. They're not logging in from the right place. They're not doing what they usually do. They're accessing things they don't usually act. This is statistically just way outside of the norm." So it almost immediately rang alarm bells. So within minutes, that security operations team was able to reach in and shut that down. What was really interesting about this one is that it went on just long enough for the hacker group to have deposited their payloads onto the network, all the hacker tools that they were going to detonate on the network. So we actually worked with that customer to build a walled garden network, and we ran their whole attack. And we ran it with their cybersecurity tools, their endpoint management tools, all of their DLP tools. And the fact is, these things just in isolation, they would occasionally ring a little bell, but you wouldn't have gotten the indication until hours later. And by this point, they'd compromised hundreds of systems. They'd swapped out the credentials for hundreds of users. There was no way that they were going to save the network at that point. If they hadn't had that AI-driven detection at the beginning, their entire network would have been wiped out. Their business would have been frozen, and they would be negotiating ransom payments with the hackers.
Well, that's a beautiful case study, Steve, of how user behavior and understanding user behavior really matters in critical situations like this. So thank you for sharing that with our viewers. So Steve, let's talk a bit about regulatory compliance. Right, there's a lot of need for innovation, like the example that you just said, and then there is also a need to comply with regulatory aspects, in particularly on AI. So how do you think that organization should be looking at, in particular in the security space,
Mhm.
and try to balance these two?
So this is a good place to kind of talk about this gear switch from when we talk about using AI to do cybersecurity to securing your AI systems. And what we see is every forward-looking business in the world is thinking about, how do I use AI? I always tell people we've seen the examples in the past of what happens when you don't keep up with these kinds of shifts. And I'm old enough to remember when we did this with the internet and the World Wide Web, and there were these companies that said, no, the web is scary. I don't understand how it works. People are getting their credit card numbers stolen. I'm not going there. And those companies have names like Sears, Roebuck, and Blockbuster. They were just wholesale replaced by things like Amazon and Netflix. And we're going to have that case now, where there are going to be well-known companies who don't really lean into AI, and they're going to be gone entirely in 10 years. So organizations need to be thinking about how to lean into AI. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot new you need to learn. You need to learn how to use it effectively, how to be most productive with it, but ultimately you also need to learn to secure it. And this was one of the things that had to happen early in the web. Groups like OWASP developed things like the original OWASP top 10 list, which I think was 2000 or 2001. So it was when the web was only a few years old. They'd started to develop this guidance about how do you develop secure web applications. What was interesting is, kind of coming full circle, back in 2023, I started this group at OWASP to say, what are the vulnerabilities in applications that embed a large language model? And when you think about it, companies are developing, chatbots for technical support, agents for financial analysis. It's all over the board, but every one of those now, they're built around a large language model, whether it's OpenAI, Gemini, Anthropic, DeepSeek. There's a lot in common in terms of the things that can go wrong. And what that means is we're in the very early innings of understanding that. People are still figuring out how to build this, but we are starting to see the early pieces of the compliance frameworks start to catch up. We're 2.5 years into this transformation, and it's just now starting to be there. But I do think that as a CISO, as a compliance officer at a large company, you need to build a strategy for AI that isn't, we're not going to do AI. I still run into CISOs who are trying to figure out, how do I block up all the ports so that people aren't giving away all my secrets? And ultimately, in some ways, it's really not that different from that perspective than it was when we went through the transition to cloud computing. There was a point where people said, I'm not going to give my customer lists to Salesforce.com. I'm not going to give my files to Microsoft. Of course, we've all done that at this point. We figured out how to manage those things. We figured out how to put things in place that allow us to control those things. We figured out how to put policies around them so we can educate users on how to do that safely. And so I'd say my big piece of advice to a CISO is, think about what you had to do for SaaS, and then think about how you're going to map that to what do you need to do for AI.
Yeah. So Steve, you spoke about the OWASP GenAI Security Project, right? Can you tell us more, viewers, more about what that entails?
Yeah. So little more than 2 years ago, I proposed to OWASP, which is the Open Worldwide Application Security Project. It's basically an open source foundation, has a few 100,000 members worldwide dedicating to creating secure software. And so I went to the board and proposed, how about we create some guidelines for large language models? Honestly, at the time, I thought maybe I would find 10 people in the world who were interested in this, because nobody was really talking about the cybersecurity implications of these systems. But it turned out a lot of people were worried about it. I had hundreds of people volunteer to be on the expert group in the first couple weeks. We put out the first version of that guidance in the middle of 2023. We've updated a few times. We now have a 2025 version. But it's been read hundreds of thousands of times and has become a bit of a de facto standard. But really what it does, quite simply, is list the top 10 things you should worry about, which turns out to just be a really impactful format. It's a 30-page document. You can read it in an afternoon and get a good picture for what are some of the risks. Ultimately, as you get further and further into it, that top 10 list became so successful, people just kept asking for more guidance. That wound up with me writing this book for O'Reilly. But as far as the OWASP group, we've put out documents now on AI red teaming, super hot topic, agentic security. We always had some basic guidance for agents because we knew people would build them early on. It's now become so complicated, it has to be its own topic. The agentic security guide is longer than the whole top 10 list document. We even put out documents for, specific to defenders. How do you deal with, or how do you prepare for, and how do you deal with when you're being attacked by people with deep fake technology who are going beyond phishing to different levels of trying to socially engineer data from you. So the group's now gone from being just the top 10 list to being what we call the GenAI Security Project. And we probably published a dozen different documents now. And they're all available at genai.owasp.org, and you can just go there and check them out.
Yeah. So for my viewers, you'll see the description of this of the website that Steve's talking about in the description of this video. So Steve, that brings us to the next part of the show, which is the the feature segment round, and we sort of have started already speaking about it. So in your view of things, and you are seeing things with a very clear way, right? What are some of the top, let's say, 3 or 4, 5 things, in particularly at the intersection of AI and security, that you're most excited about, at the same time also scared about?
So I think the biggest thing that is happening right now from a baseline AI technology point of view is this switch from sort of the emphasis being on training to the emphasis being on inference. And it was originally early on, it was we talked about chain of thought prompting, where it was how do you coax the AI into thinking a little more step by step. And it turned out to be really, really powerful to do that. And I think that led the researchers down this route to saying, well, if the human can prompt it to do that, why can't it just create those loops itself? And we'd seen these cases in more special purpose AIs when they're playing chess or poker, that ability to think longer about problems resulted in dramatically increased performance. And that's what we're seeing on these models. And you start with OpenAI 01 and now 03 and 04, and all of the major players are now creating these reasoning models. From an agentic point of view, creating these agents that have some more reasoning means that they can work on much longer running tasks and that they can better self-correct as conditions change. So I'm very excited about that. I think we're just in the early innings there, and we're going to see these things get smarter and smarter and basically able to do more and more reasoning. The flip side of that, though, is what am I worried about, which is the bad guys all now have frontier class AI systems. It was if you think back, really only a few months ago, back in January, that people really understood that the organization DeepSeek had released a frontier class reasoning model entirely for free, entirely in open source from China. And what that means is that every hacker from nation state sponsored hacker in North Korea to a script kiddie somewhere in South Africa has access to AI that is roughly the equivalent of the best in the world. And despite our best attempts to say we don't want people using those for bad, they're definitely going to.
Yeah, it's a huge equalizer in that sense, because the entry barriers are so low in a way that almost everybody can have access, good, bad, ugly, whatever it might be. Yeah. So Steve, another question on this note. So given that so many things are evolving, if you had to set the agenda for the global cybersecurity market in the world of AI, what would your top priorities be, and how would you go about defining the agenda for the next decade?
Oof. It's funny. Anytime people ask me these questions, I was at RSA and I was on a panel and somebody asked us for predictions for 2030, which sounds like a good date for a science fiction movie, right? 2030. That's 4.5 years away now. And you can't think like we've thought in the past, given the level and rate of change. We thought things were changing fast since the onset of the internet. This is entirely different, right? It took years for Facebook to get its first million users. It took days for ChatGPT to get its first million users. So we're in this dramatic rate of change. And when I got asked at RSA for predictions for 2030, I sat back and I said, okay, by 2030, and it was about agents, but by 2030, we'll have 1 million free roaming androids on the streets of the United States. And everybody looked at me like I was crazy, but I'm not. And I think we all see this, is we're getting very close to being able to develop and deploy real robotics that are not cost prohibitive. I imported a robot dog from China this year. Cost me a few $1,000s. The thing is incredibly capable, from just the ability to use its low-level AI algorithms to navigate broken terrain and go up and down stairs and all of these other things. And we're starting to see these with much more general robotics platforms. So I do say, while 25 is the year of the AI agent, and you said that earlier, and I agree with you, and I say that all the time, 26, maybe 27 is going to be the year of the robot. And from a cybersecurity perspective, there is nothing we should be more worried about than how do we secure this next set of systems. And I'm not talking about, I'm not the guy who watched Terminator too many times. But I am the guy who's just paying attention to the fact that when we talk about things like excessive agency, it's one thing to say I have, a bot that can generate some text on the internet that might do something bad, to I have a robot roaming the streets. And again, you say, Steve, you're crazy. Robots will not roam the streets, but I can hop in a 4,000-pound robot that will drive me around San Francisco by just paging it with my phone today. It's not science fiction. We all watched the videos of Ukraine blowing up half of Russia's Air Force with some drones they smuggled in on a truck. This is real. And in terms of cybersecurity, securing agents is going to be really hard, and we'd better lean hard into that this year, next year. But that's just a stepping stone to securing these kind of cyber physical systems that come next.
Yeah. No, that's amazing, Steve. I mean, there's so many things that we thought impossible a couple of years ago are now, being done right in front of our eyes. Steve, how are you thinking about your own roadmap at Exabeam, and what kind of recommendations are you providing to clients, more from a future oriented and more from a roadmap perspective, to your customers?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that we're talking about with our customers, and one of them really is thinking about your data strategy. It's never been more important. And we talked about this, about some of that initial disappointment in these early AI experiments. If your data is all in silos and all formatted differently and things like that, the ability to have a large language model just sift through that all, it's too hard, and it's going to be too hard for a long time. On the other hand, if you can think through your data strategy and how are you going to bring that together, how are you going to normalize it, that opens up the door to these agentic use cases. And I think people need to be thinking about agents for a few different use cases. Certainly cybersecurity investigations is going to be the first area where we're going to see really widespread adoption of agents, just because there's this proliferation of cybersecurity products and alerts where we just keep getting more and more of them, and it's not sustainable and humans can't keep up. So cybersecurity agents are going to have a major role in driving those investigations. And I tell individuals at this point, people who want to get into cyber or just entering the workforce there, you certainly still need to have a grounding in basic cyber techniques, but very rapidly, more rapidly than the previous generation, you're going to become a team lead. Just there may be no other humans on that team that you're leading. You're going to have a team of specialized agents, and you're going to need to start to think like a manager. And that's a much different set to think about from an individual perspective. From a CISO perspective, when you're thinking about building your organization and building your teams, you need to think about which of the roles are going to be filled by humans and which roles are going to be filled by AI agents. I don't think, honestly, that means in the next few years you're going to employ less humans. That's naive. The fact is, we have 10 times the amount of work that humans can do today if you're going to effectively run your SOC. So for the next few years, this is going to be about catching up, and it is going to be about building your organization in a way that that you're prepared to take these AI agents on and build effective teams where those agents become critical parts of your team. And there's going to be a lot of debate from an ethics perspective, an HR perspective about how do we think about these members of the team. They're not people. We don't have to treat them the same. But at the same time, they're going to be filling some of the roles that you may think about filling with humans right now, or at least augmenting them.
Yeah, the future is going to look like that, right? We'll have teams of both humans and agents. So yeah, wonder what the chief people officer role would look like.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a conversation for another day. Okay, so Steve, with that, we move on to the next part of our show, which is the rapid fire round.
All right.
Okay, so here's my first question to you. What is one AI myth that you wish would disappear?
Sorry, can you say that one again?
What is one AI myth that you would like to disappear?
AI myth. Oh, fun. Here's one from a cybersecurity point of view, which is in the very early days of ChatGPT, there was a story that emerged. It got broad coverage, and it was about companies disclosing information to ChatGPT, and that information becoming available in the open. And ever since then, every CISO has been in a panic that if their employees are using ChatGPT, that all of their secrets will be shared. I do think there's an element of hygiene there, where CISOs should be building policies about what you share with any kind of software outside of your organization. But it's created this myth that any piece of data that gets sent to an LLM could be remembered and regurgitated. And it's just nonsense. And I think it sent people down the wrong roads when thinking about securing their AI strategies, that what they want to do is treat it as some kind of DLP problem, where the problem is employees telling third-party language models their secrets. I think what's interesting, and I've done research on this and I've talked to people about it, that first case that was publicized was about Samsung and some chip plans. Nobody I know thinks that even happened anymore. It's like some crazy rumor. There's no actual primary sources on it. There's nobody at Samsung who will tell you that story. So I think that's really the myth. Is I do tell people when they're developing software with large language models, they need to be really careful about their ability to overshare information. But that's mostly from the person building the application, attaching it to important data that it shares by accident. I've never really seen a case of somebody just using a large language model, disclosing some information, and that somehow winds up getting into the training set, surviving through the mill of being just one piece of data out of the LLM, reading the entire internet during training. I don't think that's what's happening. And I think I would love to expunge that myth.
That's an interesting one, and I'm sure that would give some solace to a lot of our viewers who frequently use Perplexity or ChatGPT in the regular work.
Don't get me wrong, you should definitely check the box that says don't use my data for training, but I do the same thing with every other SaaS service that I do.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? That's something that people should always use. But at the same time, it's not to say that you share your username and password. Hey, Perplexity or Claude, here's my username and password. Go run with it. Yes. So just for our viewers, awesome. That's a good myth buster. The second one that we have for you: if you could instantly solve one cybersecurity problem with AI, what would it be?
Oh boy. I wish at some level that there was just one problem in cybersecurity to be excited about solving. But I will tell you what I think a bunch of my customers wish AI would solve for them. And I host a customer advisory board every year. So we've done it 2 years in a row, getting ready to have our third one. And the people there are generally chief information security officers, deputy CISOs, head of security operations. They are people who are technical. They may have come up through security background, but at this point they're leaders. And they're really looking further than just like, hey, I wish you would detect a few different kinds of attacks. They're looking at, how is this going to help me build my strategy? And how's this going to help me communicate to my stakeholders? And what I find so interesting about this one is, depending on a large language model to build strategy for you is a little crazy. I saw one really fun thing where somebody put out, they had ChatGPT play chess against the Atari 2600 chess game from 1977, and the Atari 2600 won. So these basic models are still not great at overall strategy, but they are good is for helping you build strategy, for playing what-if games, for bouncing off ideas. The other is that I always remind people what LLMs are great at is communicating, for translating language, for translating your ideas into clearer ways to present them. And so what this customer advisory board's been asking me for a couple of years is, help me communicate to my peers, help me to communicate to my board. I've had some of them tell me that, like, hey, during a crisis, you know what my job is? And I want to say, you're leading the team and you're doing this. And they said, no, I'm reduced to a copy editor. And what they're getting during a crisis is all of these mishmashed reports from different analysts and different people in the organization, many of which spent their time in computer class, not English class, or don't have English as a first language anyway. And they're taking in all these reports and trying to synthesize them and trying to make them clear and trying to make them available to an executive audience. I think the opportunity there is so large right now for us to help that audience and for them to fundamentally transform the way that they work.
Wow, that's a brilliant idea for somebody listening to this show, for some new ideas, fresh ideas on creating a new product in the cybersecurity space. So any startup founders, if you're listening to this, Steve is a guy to go chase. All right, the third one. What is the most underrated tool or practice in the security industry today?
Oh boy. What's interesting is so many of my examples come from this idea of user behavior analytics. And I have so many of these stories where it's been the fundamental differentiator between success and failure. But it only works in that environment where the data is organized and groomed. And so many people in the last 10 years have tried to build systems like this without understanding that. Even pre-ChatGPT, just building the older style machine learning algorithms. And so many people in the industry have tried a product that says it does user behavior analytics and hasn't achieved success, because not all of them actually worked. Again, easy to put a name on a box and do some demos. AI is one of those things, but really finding the way to make it work in your environment, it's totally transformative, and people underestimate that. So I think that is something to know, that going forward with the amount of data you have, you can't have humans just writing Splunk queries and staring at log file lines. You're going to have to bring AI into the equation, but it's going to require a rethink on some of the low levels of how you approach this, and then it's going to require a rethink on some of the processes for how you actually run your organization.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'll move on to the next one. Who is a leader or thinker in AI or security that you admire most?
Oh boy. I would say, at the intersection of AI and cybersecurity, one of the guys that I do a fair bit of work with is John Sotoropoulos. John runs the Agentic Security group at OWASP, and John works for a company called Kynos out of the UK that does a lot of consulting in the cybersecurity area. And he was really one of the first deep cybersecurity practitioners to get the idea that AI needs to be secured. And, he's been out there not just working with OWASP, but working with these larger government organizations like NIST and MITRE, and just making a tremendous difference out there. So he's somebody that I would definitely follow.
Well, that's wonderful, Steve. I'll also reach out to him in my own selfish interest and see if we could have him on the AI with Arun show. So thank you. And then the last one I have for you. What's your favorite way to unwind or recharge after a challenging day?
All right. So I'll give you two, and I don't do either of them as much as I want to, but one of them you can see on the back there. I've got my guitars. I love to play guitar. The other one, though, that I don't have anywhere on the wall in here, but I do have a black belt in Taekwondo. I don't do Taekwondo actively anymore, but I do make sure I get to the UFC gym for kickboxing at least once a week. And there is no better way to clear your head and blow off steam than punching something really hard.
Yeah, you're right, Steve. And for our listeners, I want to underline what Steve said. Irrespective of how busy you're at work, mental peace, mental wellness is extremely important in today's days and age. So yeah, learn that from Steve. Awesome. So Steve, that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you so much for spending the time with our viewers.
Thanks so much for inviting me. This was a really fun discussion. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.